G'day, welcome back. Today I'm starting a new series which I'm calling Edge Cases. Why I've called it that will become clearer as we look through the examples. Now, if you've been following my video series on corresponding squares, you'll see that's very closely related to basically is king and pawn endgames. And it relies on the fact that because kings have quite limited motion, that they can't jump two squares and so on. Corresponding squares really have to be on a certain square at a certain time to hold the draw or to force the win, whichever the case may be. Now, we don't talk so much about that in terms of the pieces in endgames. However, there is a sort of a comparable concept of winning zones and drawing zones, which we see all the time, right? And the idea of edge cases is looking at those zones and particularly the edges of the zones to try and understand exactly what's going on in those situations. Just quickly show you a couple of examples here. Here's a screen grab from my Kerr's book. Here's a famous drawing zone in Rook and Pawn Endgame, part of the Vancouver sort of position. And Romanovsky came up with this drawing zone, and he got it right many years ago when he didn't have a computer to help him. And you see in that position of the black king and the black rook, and the similar white rook and the white pawn on the sixth rank. The white king in that zone, it's a draw, and if the white king's outside of that zone, the white king will be able to go across and support the pawn and win. So that's one example. There's quite a few in Rook and Pawn endgames, and I've got another one here. Let me bring that up. Once again from the Kerr's book, and this is Queen and Pawn endgames. We see a lot of those. You can see there's different drawing zones for the Rook pawn. You can see in the top left there. Once again, it really depends upon where the king and the pawn and the queen are, and you can see another one there, bishop pawn. Now those two drawing zones. The general idea is it tended to be, I grew up knowing that you had to be within two moves a certain square and you'd be able to force the win if you were white. And we'll sort of get onto that when we look at those zones. But it's sort of, the zone's a big area. Distill what's the really key factor determining why it's a win or a draw. And you can see the parallel to corresponding squares here, right? It's sort of, it's in a given position where you have to be to force the win. Now, I've had a bit of a gap here in terms of my recording videos because this took a little bit of time. I spent a bit of time on a Python script which is still work in progress and may well crash as we're looking at these things. So to demonstrate what I've been doing, I think I'd look at a very basic Rook and Pawn endgame. I've set that up over on my skid capture screen. So here is a fairly standard position. We have the Rook on A8. The pawn has been pushed to a7. Now what that does is the black rook in this situation is behind the pawn, but the black rook can't move away from behind the pawn. That's the advantage of pushing the white pawn to a7. Disadvantage is there's no hiding space for the white king, and as long as black doesn't fall to some simple traps at the start, he can always check the white king ad infinitum. So what I've marked out there with key squares, just like with corresponding squares, is if the black king is on any of those squares, either side to move, it's a draw, because the white rook cannot get out of the way without losing the pawn. If the black king's on this block of squares here on the queen side, then the white pawn will drop, and if the black king is on G7 or H7, then there's nothing that white can do. Now, in this position, with white to move, white actually moves by a standard trick because the rook can move, and if black then took the pawn, then there is this nasty skewer with check. Okay, right, so that's the... Just clear those. That's the threat. Okay, so let's have a look. Now, if we look at the squares around the gold squares, so any of these squares here, and there's black to move, then black simply moves on to the key squares and he is safe. So these are the squares which I'm calling edge cases. So black to move is safe. White to move, all those squares I've just marked out loses. And we can do this in a corresponding squares type of concept, right? For instance, if the black king is there, then white will simply move his rook away and queen the next square. Ditto, but in this case, white will move to b8, and that will be check, and then promote next move. If on c5, same idea, check. And if on this square or that square, then you check there and promote next move. Let's go over to the king side for a second. So if you're on this square, you're checking here, this square, checking here, this square, checking here. Okay, so you seem to have covered a lot of squares. And then now I've left deliberately these two squares here, which we'll call f8. And then that falls to the run across and do the skewer. So if black is on those squares, sort of a split key square over there, corresponding square. Now, you can see that in this case, it is almost one for one. That's quite unusual, and it tends to be that because pieces have ranges they can move to and so on, that it's zones of movement which actually would provide a win or a loss. So in this case, we've looked at this very simple endgame. Everybody knows the answer. You've got to be on h7 or g7 to avoid the skewer, or you've got to be right next to the pawn and pick it up. Otherwise, black is losing. So when you're thinking about transitioning rook endgames and so on, you need to think about this type of position. Okay, so they've been using skid. Now, I mentioned this script I got running. I'll load it up now, and this is usually using the usual sort of software which I've been talking about in the past, Python Chess, our workhorse. Maybe we should call it Build the Pony. And then I've also used the syzygy table bases, and also I use Pygame to sort of get a bit of animation, because I want to be able to visualize not just quite a straightforward piece, sort of corresponding square edge cases like this, but those more complicated ones I was showing you earlier. So let's move on to that. Okay, first off, I'll just explain the little app I'm running. Once again, if you see what I'm running there, I've got this software called Hover, and you give it an input which I've already defined in terms of a fan. So I load that up. Just to explain what's going on here, you can see the top right boxes. This is for black to move, the result from white's point of view. So this would be black to move, but white to win. And then if we move the rook around, it shows you the squares which are relevant, right? Now, that makes sense. Those green squares are all the squares which white would win with black to move. And you can see the main point there is that those two zones we were talking about, unfortunately it'll move around. This area is sort of around B7 and also the area around G7. That's the two drawing zones, right? And then what I'm able to do, so I have one piece which I can move, and then the circled king is, that's those positionings of the king, which would, in this case, still be a win for white. Now, of course, the more interesting cases, I'll change the result to a draw, and I'll make it from the black side, although draw doesn't really matter. Better. Results, side. Okay, so this is a move, black to move, and result is a draw. Okay, now this is looking very similar to what we saw before. You can see in that area on the top left, top right, top left is the same as before. If you're on A6, B6, C6, and so on, then it's a draw. And also, if you're on A5, B5, C5, D5, it's also a draw if black is the move. But what I've highlighted there, if white is the move, it's red. So if white is the move, it wouldn't be a draw. So that means black has to do something, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run a script here, which will using the engine now. I could have used the table base. There's a reason I didn't, to come up with the sort of a combination of corresponding moves, as it were. You can see here that highlighted the square on B2. If the black king is on B2, then black would have to play king to A1 to draw. In fact, this is the extra square we didn't have last time, that the black king can hide behind the rook. There's no checks, right? So the white rook can't move, and that is also a draw. But it's be a very unusual position to encounter in a real game, right? So that's the first one. Okay, that makes sense. So that's telling you what's going on there. The key here, in fact, if we go to the next square, this is all about the black king hiding on a1. Right, so there's one sort of important lesson we've learned from just looking at these edge cases, right? Now, this is an unusual one, right? The king is on b3. How do we draw this? And the answer is it's just interminable checks, right? You can see that that's actually saying rook a1, rook a2, check, 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 check. And then if this is a funny one, you wouldn't think about it. If the white king ever goes on to the third rank, then the black king will get away to the what would then be the a2 square, even with check, right? So that's an extra square you wouldn't expect to be a drawing square because of that checking technique. Now let's move on to the other positions we can look at. Okay, so if you're on a5, you've got to move to b6, b6, you move to, sorry, b5, you move to b6. You could also move to c6. The squares which are red, and this one, in fact, it's showing a lot. Actually, it goes c5, b6, and grabs the pawn. I think with the rook, I think that's what's going on there. A little bit unclear, but that's sort of the process. White can't do anything about that. I'll just highlight. You can see that one square, the b3 square, that's cyan color, and that means black has only one move to draw in that case, and that was that checking procedure. All these other squares, I could think this one only has one square, right? He's basically playing d5 to c6 and then pick up a pawn, but of course black can do checks first, so it's not the only move to draw, and we continue. So all of those squares on the top left are all the king runs into that box and picks up the pawn. And then now we look at the kingside positions, exactly the same, that black just moves his king into the h7 g7 box and is a draw. Okay, right, so now we've learned the lesson about procedure. So there's three drawing procedures here, depending upon which zone the black king is in. He either has to hide behind the rook, he either has to go into the box around b7 to grab the pawn, or he has to go in the box g7, h7 to avoid that skewer technique. So that has looked at it from the black point of view. So now let's move it, press this key here, and now we're talking about change the side. Right, so now we go white to move and white to win. And you can see that you've basically come out with the same set of boxes. Obviously, there'll be a different set of moves. So let's calculate that set of moves now. Give it a second. It's basically given a second each position on Stockfish, and that gets a lot deeper than you would think. Right, okay, so lots of cyan squares. So in fact, in a lot of these cases, there's only one move to win. Right, so you can see the blue square there down the bottom, b1, winning move, rook to b8, check. And the next square is the same. Let's have a look at that. Right, once again, it's rook b8 check, and the pawn remote. Once again, if the king is on b3, then it's rook b8 check. So that's the threat, right? If you're not hidden behind the rook, then the threat is simply check and promote. Okay, so let's go to the next box. Okay, there's a couple of strange squares over here, which I'm not going to go through because I don't think they're relevant. Okay, so here we are with this next edge squares, and then there's nothing to be done. Rook b8 by white, and the king can't be captured, and it's going to promote. And if the king is on any of these squares, then it's a check on the 8th rank and promote. Same thing here. Same thing here. So now we've learned the lesson. Any king position which is not on the 7th rank, i.e. in the 6th rank, just gets checked away. And it could be the 5th rank, could be the 4th rank. So that's the problem. And then now we get to these interesting squares where if you're on d7, then it can be rook to g8. Don't know why rook to h8 hasn't been given as well. And then there is the same issue, right? That you do the rook to the h file and you do the skewer, and pawn will promote, or if you take with the rook, then you get skewered. So I think that sort of helps you to understand why those drawing zones exist. The threat of the rook is basically check and promote, or swing across and skewer, and if black doesn't protect against those threats, then he will lose. Right, so that is the gist of this little software I've done, and a very simple example. And I think if you go through the solutions for both white and for black, you can better understand how to draw the position and what the threats are. Right, so what I'll do now is, whilst that was running, I'm actually creating a PGN which has those lines in it. So we'll just quickly go to that now and see how you can use that to further train yourself on this Rook Endgame. Okay, here are the files. I've given them strange names. Rook A7 is what I've called this position, which just stores a fan and loads it in, right? And then you can see Rook A7, black to move, result draw, Rook A7, white to move, result win. So let's have a look at those two files. So you can see there's a game list, and each game corresponds to certain position, like 15 squares we're looking at. Actually, I'm not too sure. I'd loaded up white and black with the move. But here you can see it in this is the king on b1 and the rook on a8. So let's have a look at that one. It's the one we've got. And then we can just have a look at the moves, right? So this is white to move. There's the winning move. And it's the only winning move. Okay, cool. So let's move on to the next game. Same idea, right? Just follow. I got the PGN. Let me put the PGN over here. So you can see it has a PGN for each game. Let's just load next. And these all have one variation. Oh, this is different. This has multiple possible wins. In fact, basically the white rook can move almost anywhere. It can be rook b8 or rook g8 or rook e8. And it'd be a win. So let's keep on flick through these games. And we'll look at the skewer positions. That's the deal with that. She's not showing the skewers. So something a little bit wrong with my code, but you get the idea. The mini move would be here. Okay, so that's the idea with that. And then if you want to have a look and understand what's going on with the black draws, then we'll load up the rook a7 move, black result draw. Okay, this is this position here. And this shows you there's two drawing lines, which I didn't highlight before. Funny things pop up when you look at these things in more detail, right? So you can see the main line is saying king a1, there's no checks, the rook will just go up or down this file and check and whatever. And if the white king got to b6, then you check from that side, right? So there's no win there. But funnily enough, go back, rook a1 is also a draw. Yes, let's go on rook a1. What's going on there? It's that discovered check trick I mentioned before, because now let's say the white rook moves away. This is doing king, but let's say the white rook does move away. Let's add variation. Then discover check and pick up the pawn. Right? So that's quite funny. You see these little sort of variations you didn't really think about. And then the same thing here. All these is, you can see there's a couple of variations. From b6, go to c6 or a6. Both of those draw because it gets you inside that drawing box. And it shows you there. Right, that's good. And yeah, just quickly flick through this. So we've got this file which tells you all the drawing moves and techniques. And if you run the little script, and then you've got these this PGN to look at, then that would be a way of just sort of practicing or just going through the lines and understanding what's going on there. I'm going to try and attach these PGNs to the video on YouTube. We'll see how that works. Haven't done that before. And then I'm going to close out with one last thing. It's like now we're experts on this particular endgame with a rook on a8 and a pawn on a7 in just this 5-piece endgame. Then the final sort of trick is to go and look for real games and see what happened in this position in real games and whether people drew correctly or other things happened, and the idea is which scenario is most likely. Does the king tend to be on the kingside corner or the queenside corner? So let's go and look at that. I have to load up a new database for that. Give me 1 second. Okay, here we go. Database has been loaded up. There's 126 games. I did this using a filter of Scoutfish and Casabase. Remember Scoutfish, you were able to put in specifications. They call it a subfen. And in the subfen, I had white rook on a8 and a white pawn on a7. That makes sense. And then the second condition was the king rook pawn versus king rook balance. Ran that through the Casa database, and it gave me back these 126 games. And I'm going to look at about the first 10, and we'll see what sort of insights we can get by, now we've done the analysis of what the threats are and how to deal with certain positions and where the safe zones are on that position. What have people done in that position in real life, and how did that position come about in the game? Right, the first game we've got a biggie. You can see it's Tarish versus Paul Jonna. Tarish competed for the World Championship, lost. Paul Jonna, well-known player from the same era. We'll go to the move where a7 got played, right? Now, this position is drawn. This is a funny one because the rook is not behind the pawn, which makes it somehow riskier. But, I mean, who knew? There's a defensive strategy here with the rook on the 7th rank. It's keeping an eye on the pawn so the rook can't move. And then you just have to make sure that you don't get checked from behind. And that's basically just go through what happened with the game here. So checks the king, and you hide your king behind your rook. And then if the white king tries to get across to, well, in this case, I think the pawn's going to drop. But if the white king tries to get across to the queen side, you just check it away. So that's I've just learned a new drawing technique. Now, what I'm going to do here is actually we're going to go back to a previous position right here. And I'm going to ask you, how would you win this game? Now, actually, there is a win here. And what Tarish played was king c3, and that was a draw. But let's have a look what the winning line is. The winning line is a7. So let's have a look what goes on here. Right, so in this position, black's got a couple of moves. Let's have a look what happens if he plays rook d7 check. That seems to be like a natural move. And king moves across to c3 now. And what is the difference? So let's have a look at this king d5. Trying to hide king b4. Black can't play there because it's like gets checked on c8, and then that will be a win for white. So what's happened here is that, unfortunately for black, white gets across to the corner squares, and black can't get across, right? So I think the other lesson we've learned there is that in this technique, you need to, let's go back, you need to be able to get your king to the c file basically before the white king does. The white king is darting across and does get to the corner, so that's quite interesting. And we go back a little bit further. This game is quite interesting. And here, rook takes b6, and there was a drawing line here. What Don did, king takes f4 was the game continuation, and he ended up down that pawn, whereas in fact rook takes h4 is continuation, where if you go rook takes h4, then you get this pawn, and you get this pawn, and if white gets that pawn, then I think you end up getting that pawn. So it kind of, you don't end up with that pawn up endgame anyway, so the game probably should have been a draw. Anyway, that was quite interesting. So let's move on to the next game, a game between Seidman and Santassieri. Butchered that. And what I want to do is I want to go to the position here. Now the position rook to pawn to a7. Now that's the winning move, right? I mean, there are other ways of winning, but right, this is a winning move because this is this classic position where black wants to hide in here, but we've got a f pawn, but we've got an f pawn, and the f pawn is just going to advance, and the black king can't do anything about it, because if the black king did anything about it, then he'd be on one of the squares which are mined. So that shows you this extra lesson in this endgame, where black had everything sorted, would have been a draw, except unfortunately in this case there's this extra f pawn, which any center pawn is well the same problem, whereas g or h pawn you just ignore it, and then you're generally okay. So that was another sort of little aspect to learn. Let's go on to the next game. Here's the position. It's this strange position again. It seems to occur a lot where it's the side attack on the rook, and once again this position is actually drawn, but only if black moves across. But black's drawing line is let's have a look at what it is. So it goes, drawing line goes rook e7 check. See, the king wants to dart across to the queen side, hides himself from the checks. King's darting across. Cancel it. I'll just continue on the game continuation I've got. And now we see this is another feature of this draw. If black can hide his king and give the rook access to the 6th rank, it's a bit like a Vancouver actually, but obviously not a Vancouver, then now the white king cannot approach and will get checked away. So that's an interesting drawing technique. So if the white king runs too quickly, then you just set up that position. That's a draw. It's amazing what I'm finding here. So, but unfortunately in this position, black didn't do that. Black played king g7, naturally thinking, obviously thinking about the normal drawing position, but that just loses. Different ways of winning. In the game, it was rook g8 check, and because the rook is beside and not behind the pawn, black takes the rook, but then white promotes to queen. So that's another little sort of lesson to be learned. Let's keep going. We had the pawn moving to a7. Difficult to find. Okay, there it is. Okay, so okay. So this is a draw, and the game was drawn, and I don't want to get into too much detail, but it's got that side defense. Black has a couple of extra pawns, so the king can't go over. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's continue. So I think I briefly looked at the first 10 games. Let's have a look at this one. A7. Once again, a draw because of the extra pawns going to cancel. If we look, what move? I should have been doing this before. Sorry. I mean, what move would you play? And Black played the logical move. Get back in there so he doesn't get checked from behind. And there are interesting ways, but once that exchange occurred, then we know it's drawn. Black's just going to sit on g7, h7, and there you go. Okay, well played by Black in that case. Let's have a look at the next one. Okay, so this is a draw again, right? And the idea is White will hide behind his rook, and then if the White king does dart over to the queen side, then he'd set up his king on the 5th rank, and his rook could check the White king away on the 6th rank, if you remember that strategy. However, Black did not do that, so he played a losing continuation. Let's have a look. King g7, and then now just it's the same thing. We saw that before, right? Just careless, right? And if you want to look at the drawing line, we'll see it again. Rook g7 check. This is almost identical, right? And then now we're set up. There's a very important drawing resource if you are in face that position. Okay, let's have a look at this next game. We'll just go through pretty quickly, which is this is heading to Vancouver. It is a draw. The Vancouver draw here is done as a continuation. Rook check and stick your rook on f6. King approaches, you check it. And so that's simple, but what happened is that he played king f7, and now he can't get the Vancouver position. He could win first off by just a7 because the rook's in the wrong position. The rook has to get behind the pawn. The rook is not behind the pawn at the moment, so a number of moves win. That's one of the winning moves, and that's just the wrong move. Now what would you do? What do you do as White in this position? There's several wins, but the most blatantly obvious one is just push the pawn, which is what the player did. And now the king is too far away from his safety squares, and the rook is not behind the pawn anyway. So that was the end of that. Okay, let's keep going. Where are we up to? Got a couple more to go through. I mean, this is what I think. I'll try and save this PGM to the video as well. Not too sure if I can do that. And as I said, I'm just going to quickly go through the first 10 here. But the point is that you could go through any of these positions and just try and understand is the sort of the relevant points you take from the analysis we've just done. Okay, so here in this position, we've got this position here. King h4 has just been played. Yeah, we'll just get back and we'll just sort of see where we are. So this is basically White picking up that last pawn, right? King h4. Now, unfortunately, what do you see is wrong with this position? The obvious thing is that the Black king is in the wrong spot. Can the Black king survive? In fact, according to the database, Black just resigned here. But let's continue the game and see what happened. What could have happened. This is a stockfish continuation. So the White king goes across. Interesting to see what happens. White king across. White king goes across. You have to start checking at some stage. Yeah, it's just trivially losing. The king's in the wrong spot, so that's why if your king's in that bottom right quadrant, you're probably in trouble. Okay, let's go to the next game. King like a Vancouver at this stage. Now this position is drawn, and the way to do it is indeed Vancouver. If you know Vancouver, it's the 6th rank defense because you'll need to go effectively. If you look at this position, drawing line will be rook there, and then you'll be rook there. No problem with the arrows today, sorry about that. Arrow there. And then as the king approaches, check from the side. So this is a drawing position, but unfortunately, I think Black didn't know what he was doing. King f7. There's various moves to win. White played one of them. What would you play in this move? Move a7, because now you've got to that position where rook is out of position and the king is out of position. So there's nothing to be done. So the next move was you got the rook behind, but that's no good because now rook. Oh, now I got the skewer, and the checking won't help. Black resigned. Okay, so that was closer to knowing when to push a7 as a theme. Is this the last one we'll look at? Yeah, this is the 10th game. What do we think about this position? This is another one of these ones which probably needs some investigation. Defense along the 7th rank, and in this case, black draws because he is able to keep the white king out. Let's see what the continuation is. Yeah, and now he's got the ideal position. Nothing to be done, right? Even if the white king got around, the black rook would just hover there and be able to sort of check the king away, and hiding behind the zone rook can't be checked. Okay, so I hope that you found that interesting. Just a general approach. I mean, I'm going to do a lot more positions as time progresses, and my idea is that I'll pick one of these positions. They'll be a bit more complicated than this. That'll be that Vancouver position, or one of those queen and pawn endgames. We'll look at those edge cases, transition squares, whatever you want to call them, and then we'll understand the threats and resources on both sides. And then once you've done that and sort of got familiar with it, then you can actually go and use Scoutfish and just come up with a bunch of games and go through them and try and understand how to use those approaches like training in a real world situation. So that's all for today. I hope you found that interesting. Thank you very much for watching.